In the United States, we don't have quite that range. Also, we have less variety of price point. So when you're looking at electronics, that's a Southeast Asian issue. And that probably can be recreated in the U.S.-Mexico border region, especially with a little bit of help from Colombia. But cell phones, we make the high-end chips in the United States still, but all the other stuff is China-centric or Korea-centric. So Korea is one of the countries that's going to face the greatest challenges in the world to come. And if it was anyone else but Korea, I would say they're doomed. But the Koreans have a tendency to completely reinvent everything about their culture every 20, 30 years or so. And I don't want to bet against the Koreans. I don't know how they're going to do it. But they will probably, do kind of what the European automakers have done and just put a huge amount of foreign direct investment in the United States, particularly in the South, and somehow make that work. One advantage of cell phones is they're a high enough value-added product that you can fly them. And that opens up some horizons that might not have been there otherwise. But Apple is so screwed. Apple, every time something has gone wrong in China or with Chinese-American relations, Apple has gone the other direction. They've never diversified. They keep concentrating more and more on a China-centric system. And they are now the global company most exposed to a China crack. They've taken no intermediate steps to mitigate the problems that are coming. So I can see the entire Apple ecosystem just disappearing for 4 or 5 years until such time as the supply chain can be rebuilt somewhere else. And that means if you have an Apple iPhone, I hope you like it. And I hope you don't think you're going to get another one anytime soon, because it's just not going to happen. This next release is probably going to be the last one for 5 years. I would say some of the good canaries in the coal mine, although some of them are already starting to watch how the Europeans deal with pensions. That's a great start. The Europeans are some of the most advanced economies in the world, and there's also some of the ones that are, from an age point of view, are most advanced. So we're seeing increasing levels of retirement within Europe with a shrinking tax base because there haven't been new children for so long. So Germany hits that peak point in like 2026. I would argue that Italy is probably on the precipice right now. Russia would be a great one to watch because they're crossing the Rubicon right now, but Russian data right now is not exactly trustworthy. Japan is in that same bucket. Korea is in that same bucket. And you can watch how the pension costs have just ballooned over time, but the tax take is now going down. So these are becoming debt-driven societies in a world where international finance is breaking down. So the capacity of these countries to maintain the retirement standards of living that they're used to are just going away. China is a great example to watch for supply chains. Every time the supply chain in China breaks, someone somewhere figures out a way to plug things together in a new way and replace it. So the Chinese COVID vaccine really does not work. And we're now facing an environment where the Chinese are forced to lock down because it's the only tool they have. So as places like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Guangzhou go offline, if you are China-centric in your supply chain system, you're screwed right now. But the early movers who saw what was coming and started working with the Mexicans a few years ago, they're doing great. They've got cheaper labor costs, they've got higher productivity, they've got less transport issues, fewer insurance issues, fewer energy issues. All of these things that have kind of been building up steam over the last 15 years have really combined into a fundamentally new way to work. And China is the poster child for how it shouldn't go now. For manufacturing, probably not. Right now, it's a combination of short-run stuff with, say, additive manufacturing machine shops to do the small runs closer to populations, or if you have economies of scale, doing some sort of assembly line. And you really can't speed that up. And if any of the new technologies are coming out, they're going to be dealing with a more constrained labor environment. So again, moving away from the China model. So that probably can't help. I'd say in terms of agriculture, however, there are some really interesting things going on. Genomics, whether it's GMOs or gene editing, at the rate they're expanding, they're probably going to be able to double yields within a decade. And if you combine digital recognition, facial recognition for people, you can now do that for plants. And so a combine with a specific set of tanks on it and cameras can take photos of each individual plant, decide if it's a weed or a crop, decide if it needs fertilizer or pesticide, and in one run, hit everything. So you're talking about things having to do 2 or 3 runs over a field for the entire season and you're done, as opposed to organic where it's something like 16, which will never work. But you combine those two, and assuming you can apply the inputs, assuming you can afford them and finance them, which is going to limit the number of places it can be done, to a lot of advanced countries with large row crop fields, you're talking about being able to increase yields by 250% before 2035. That's really impressive. We've never had that kind of expansion in yield growth. But again, it's only works in places that have the financing for the equipment and the inputs. And that means if you have to be in a large row crop environment like the United States or Canada or Australia, or have a government that's really involved in making sure their agricultural sector doesn't break down like, say, France. So there's maybe a dozen countries that can do that, and that will allow us to feed an extra 500 million, maybe even 1 billion people. That's not enough, but it's a start. Manufacturing is probably the best place to start. Modern manufacturing touches almost every country in the world, and even relatively simple products touch 50 different countries. The iPhone is one of the more complex. Automotive is one of the more complex. You're talking 30,000 pieces, each of which has their own supply chain. And by making transport cheap and safe, we can shuttle things to take advantage of labor and input price points in the United States and Canada and China and Japan and Germany, all over the world. And that's created the world that we know. To a lesser degree, the same thing holds true for agriculture, because whether it's fertilizer or fuel, there is a supply chain for that. Tractors are heavy machinery. Those supply chains are just as complicated as they are for automotive. And when pieces fall out of that supply chain, it's not like you can do it without one piece. If you've got 29,999 pieces for your car, you just have a really ambitiously sized paperweight. And so we need to move into a system with shorter steps, closer to the end consumer. And that means that a lot of these countries that have managed to kind of pull themselves off by their own bootstraps can't, unless they're dealing with a relatively constrained regional supply chain. I can see that working in Southeast Asia. Maybe we can see some version of that working in Europe if they can get the raw materials in. But North America is really lucky because we can do it the old way or the new way. While we only in North America have 1/3 of global population consumption, that's enough to supply a mass production system. Mexico's testament to that. The United States is testament to that. But we can also do it the new way, where we start to co-locate manufacturing with population centers. The technology has come far enough, fast enough, that is going to be the new norm for a lot of us. So when I look at the manufacturing of the future, I'm not just looking at the Texas-Mexico interface. I'm also looking at Jersey, because they already have the industrial space in the warehouses. They just need to bring in a few hundred machine shops. And then you're in the clear. Fossil fuel systems are different. The facilities themselves are relatively inexpensive. It's only about 20-25% of the total life cycle cost. The cost is the fuel, and that's roughly 60% of the total. Well, assuming that they're equivalent, and that's a different conversation, but let's assume for the moment that they're equivalent. A wind turbine needs that upfront financing. Well, people talk about how if you increase the cost of financing by 50 to 100 basis points, that a project fails because then the financing costs are too high. We're talking about a world where we're going to increase it by 500 to 1,500 basis points. We're talking about a fundamentally new, different, tougher financial environment.